she was his most trusted counsellor and his right hand. George R.R. Martin on Alysanne Targaryen. So Martin spoke, June 16, 2006. Good Queen Alysanne Targaryen by far has one of the best reputations when it comes to queens of Westeros, and she's rightly earned her place as perhaps the best queen Westeros ever saw. From her work bettering the lives of the smallfolk, to protecting the rights of women with the Widow's Law and the outlawing of the right to the First Night, she left the Seven Kingdoms a better place. Her husband and her brother, King Jaehaerys the Conciliator, is also held up as perhaps the best king Westeros ever saw. And when you look at what he achieved during his reign, it's really hard to argue that he wasn't. But there has been a popular discussion in the fandom over the last few years, a discussion we recently had on this channel, that Jaehaerys maybe wasn't the perfect king history made him out to be. Because like any human being, he had his blind spots and did make some damaging errors, especially when it came to how he parented his later children with Alysanne. When you also factor in the succession crisis in 92 AC after Prince Aemon's sudden death, where he had to choose between his son Baelon and Aemon's daughter Rhaenys, it does sully his reputation somewhat for a lot of fans, given the domino effect in this case of choosing Baelon over Rhaenys. So even the best rulers have areas where perhaps they could be considered poor. Given this hyper-focus on this with Jaehaerys, I thought it would be an interesting discussion to analyse the reputation of good Queen Alysanne and highlight some elements of her time as queen that are not particularly good. In fact, once I started looking into it, the impact of some of her decisions as queen could potentially really go on to play a negative role in the way history pans out, which is something I found quite surprising. Given Jaehaerys and Alysanne had a total of 13 children, a shocking number of them died very young. Yes, some of them died as babes and young children, which is unfortunate, but not an unsurprising occurrence in Westeros. But even out of those who lived, many of them died tragically young. 2 would die during childbirth, which is regrettable, and not something Alysanne could really have helped. In fact, Alysanne did try and sway Jaehaerys from marrying the likes of Daela off before she was both emotionally and physically ready, and in the cases of Aemon, Baelon and Alyssa, while their losses were tragic, nothing Alysanne could have really done would have changed their fates. But the fates of 3 of her daughters really do stand out. Such a fierce little thing she is. They say she has no need for comfort. They are wrong in that, I fear. All men need comfort. Bath on Saera Targaryen, Fire and Blood, The Long Reign, Jaehaerys and Alysanne. We arguably had the most infamous, which is the fate of Saera Targaryen, whom ended up running away from home and becoming a courtesan in Lys, after a series of scandals. Many fans hold Jaehaerys more responsible for this than anything else, but given the signs of Saera's rebellious nature were present even as a young child, an argument I've seen put forward is distracted by the sheer number of children she had. Alysanne and Jaehaerys were not giving their younger children enough attention, and thus these negative personality traits developed, which would in fact have huge consequences for their children. I do think there's certainly some truth to this idea, because while Jaehaerys and Alysanne did indeed have a lot of children, they were also, of course, the king and queen of Westeros. So not only do their younger children get less parental time due to how many of them there were, being rulers and the responsibility that comes with that lessens that time even more. Other than this, however, I don't really see how Alysanne could have prevented Saera from choosing the path she did. I think this was always Saera's nature. By the time Alysanne spotted the issues with Saera's rebellious personality and tried to warn Jaehaerys, it was well too late. Even after Saera had ran away to Lys and had been disowned by Jaehaerys, Alysanne did try and fix the situation several times to no avail, and ensured that Saera was kept safe by having people watch out for her. An argument I've seen get made is Alysanne could have just gone against Jaehaerys' wishes, flew to Lys and brought Saera home, which I guess is true. But at the same time, would this really have made the situation any better? Jaehaerys is correct that if Alysanne had gone to get Saera back, she could have very well have ended up in captivity and held for ransom. But what many people overlook here is Saera's fate is a path she chose. mostly of her own free will. We know she became a rich and powerful woman in her own right in Lys and Volantis. If she wanted to come home, she had all the means to do so. Laying the blame at Alysanne's feet for Saera is, well, reaching. But there are definitely two of her daughters who met untimely ends that I do think she does bear a lot of responsibility for. Viserra and Gael. She has no interest in kissing games, nor boys. She plays with them as she used to play with her puppies, but she would no more lie with one than with a dog. She aims much higher at Viserra. I've seen the way she preens and prances around Balon. That's the husband she desires, and not for love of him. She wants to be queen. Alysanne Targaryen to Jaehaerys. Fire and blood, the long reign. Jaehaerys and Alysanne. Before we delve into a bit of context regarding why I think Alysanne might be responsible to some degree for Viserra's sudden death in 87 AC at the age of 15, we need to recall that Alysanne and the whole family had been through a rough couple of years. In 84 AC, we of course had the scandal of Saera Targaryen, with her running away to Lys the following year. Back further in 82 AC, we had the death of Aerea Targaryen after childbirth. Prior to that, we had Prince Gaemon and Valerian, who both died as babes. Finally, when Alysanne became pregnant again for the 13th time with Gael, who was born in 80 AC, it by all accounts was a very hard pregnancy for Alysanne, with Gael also turning out to be a frail babe, putting a lot of pressure on the queen. But by 86 AC, Viserra was showing similar signs of a difficult and rebellious nature similar to that of her elder sister Saera, with it accumulating in Viserra trying to seduce her elder brother, the widowed Prince Balon. Now, to prevent things from escalating too far, Alysanne hastily arranged a marriage for her daughter to Lord Theomore Manderly, a match that did not suit Viserra at all, and was not a prospect she was thrilled by, as Theomore had grown very stout during his life, and had been widowed 4 times already by this point, and was frankly an old man, from a place far from home. Viserra first returned to her father for help, but Jaehaerys agreed with the match and refused to interfere. Viserra then would turn to Balon, hoping for him to rescue her. According to some court gossip, one night she slipped past her brother's guards, climbed naked into his bed, but when Balon found her, he sent the drunk girl away. It is believed it was Viserra's hope that if she had slept with Balon, the match with Theomore would have been called off, and she would have been betrothed to her brother. But that was ultimately not the case. In 87 AC, not long after this incident, as arrangements were being made for Viserra's departure to White Harbour, she traded clothes with one of her maids and escaped her guards, slipping away from the Red Keep for one last final night of fun and laughter with her friends, 2 minor lordlings and 4 young knights. Around midnight, the princess and her remaining companions would race back to the Red Keep on horseback. At the foot of Aegon's High Hill, Viserra's palfrey collided with the mare of one of her companions, with Viserra thrown from the saddle into a wall head first, where she died of a broken neck, only 15 years of age. Now here's the thing, it's very clear that Viserra was on a dangerous path, and that something had to be done with her before things escalated, like they did with Saera. But Alysanne's solution was not it. The idea of marrying her off quickly was seemingly pushed by Alysanne, based on the wording in Fire and Blood. It all happened very suddenly, which in itself was difficult enough, but frankly the match Alysanne made was poorly thought out and executed. While in the settings of Westeros, like in real-world history, an old man marrying a 15-year-old girl was not uncommon. Given Viserra's position as a princess of House Targaryen, it's hard to believe there were not more suitable matches that were age-appropriate for her that might have enthralled her somewhat more than a 4-timed widowed old man. You can't really blame Viserra for reacting poorly to that prospect. Also consider this. If we ignore Saera for obvious reasons, all of Viserra's elder sisters who did marry either were fine with the match that was made, or were involved in finding the match themselves. I mean, Alysanne spent years trying to find a match for Aerea Targaryen before she kind of had to force her to pick between 3 suitable candidates. So not only was the match frankly unsuitable for Viserra from the get-go, and very rushed by Alysanne, Viserra was not even given the same treatment as her elder sisters, with that slight freedom of choice. Now in Alysanne's defense here, There are some mitigating factors. Like we discussed, she'd gone through a rough few years, and after what happened with Saera, certainly left some trauma there. But all of this, regardless, would still factor into the untimely death of Viserra. The next year, the Grand Maester informed Queen Alysanne that she was once more with child, to her surprise and dismay. The writings of Archmaester Gyldain on Gael Targaryen, Fire and Blood, The Long Reign, Jaehaerys and Alysanne. The fate of Gael Targaryen, I think, is the end result of all the trauma that Alysanne had suffered over the last decade, with the sheer amount of her children dying either as babes or very suddenly, with more dying during Gael's childhood. Gael was born in 80 AC, a winter year, which gave her the nickname the Winter Child. According to some, the name was also because Queen Alysanne was in the winter of her childbearing years, 44 years old at the time of Gael's birth. Because of how frail she was, Gael was cared for by Grand Maester Elessar and a scepter named Lyra, who nursed her through her first year. After her sisters Alyssa, Daela and Viserra had died within the span of 5 years, Gael became a comfort to her mother, along with her older sister Maegelle. Gael became Alysanne's constant shadow, and even slept with her in her bed. So what this implies is Alysanne had a very close relationship with Gael. The fact she would even sleep in her mother's bed frequently goes to show just how latched on to her daughter Alysanne had become. Even as a babe, for obvious reasons, Gael was very sheltered, given that Alysanne could not cope to lose another baby. But this seems to have escalated as Gael grew up as well, with Gael perhaps becoming a very sheltered and overprotected young woman, as Alysanne's attachment to her grew deeper after the deaths of Alyssa, Daela and Viserra, and of course the scandal of Saera. All this ended up creating a young woman very protected, and naive to the ways of the world. Gael died in 99 AC at the age of 19, and officially it was stated that she died of a summer fever. It was only after the deaths of Jaehaerys and Alysanne that it came out that Gael had been seduced and impregnated by a travelling singer. Gael had given birth to a stillborn son, and overwhelmed by her grief, she had walked into Blackwater Bay and drowned. Now, we know very little about this travelling singer. The implication, given what we know of Gael's character, is he likely took advantage of her naivety and lack of worldly knowledge, making it perhaps more likely for her to find herself in a situation such as this. Of course, then when her son was stillborn, Gael just wasn't emotionally equipped or mature enough to be able to handle the loss. According to some, Queen Alysanne would never recover from losing Gael. Following her death, Alysanne could no longer stand to be in King's Landing or at the Red Keep, and Alysanne herself would then die on Dragonstone less than a year after Gael, in 100 AC. Now, while I don't think it's fair to solely blame Gael's death on Alysanne, because there were many factors at play, it is hard to ignore the fact that the way in which Alysanne raised Gael hindered her emotional and psychological development, and perhaps it can be argued that Alysanne smothered and overprotected her daughter somewhat, almost the polar opposite of what happened to the likes of Saera and Viserra. Around 58 AC, Alysanne kind of became the benefactor of the Night's Watch, personally funding the construction of a new castle to replace the Night Fort, and also negotiated the new gift, the extension of Brandon's gift, that would in theory provide the Night's Watch with much more farmable land and tax income from the villages in the gift. Something overlooked is that the new gift was deeply unpopular with not just the Northern Lords but House Stark itself, with the son of the Lord of Winterfell disputing the granting of the new gift with the maces of the Citadel of Oldtown, who in the end sided with the crown. In fact, Lord Alaric Stark himself warned Alysanne that while the North were friends to the Watch, few would be happy to cede their lands for them. But the thing is, if we take a look at the new gift by the time of the main books, it's mostly been abandoned, and is for the most part unfarmed by anyone, let alone the Night's Watch. So even if at first the Watch was able to farm the land and gain tax revenue from its people, it's clear by the time in the main books it's now doing very little of that, and in fact could also be more of a burden to the Watch, if anything else. With the wildlings frequently raiding into the gift, little intervention by the Watch. The argument is, even when the new gift was granted, the Watch didn't have the manpower to manage it, meaning without it being under the control of the Northern Lords, such as say House Umber, the lands just became abandoned, with wildlings free to raid it. The houses that border the new gift could of course help the Watch put down the wildling raids, but why would they bother when it's not their own land being raided? At least, if the new gift was still under the control of the Northern Lords, there would be more motivation to defend it, and maybe supply the Watch, who in turn is the first line of defense of your land. I think had the new gift not been made, the Watch could potentially be in a better position now. The lands would be protected by the Warden of the North and the other lords, which means it would be inhabited and farmed more consistently, which could then still supply the Watch, with lords more motivated to defend it. In fact, you might even see raids decrease in number if the wildlings know the lands south of the wall are populated and defended well. Instead of a flourishing gift, though, we get one that is largely abandoned because the people tasked with protecting it don't have the manpower or resources, and thus are not protecting it, leading to having even less resources in a never-ending cycle, sending the Watch into the spiral of decline we see at the start of the books. So while Alysanne was well-meaning with the new gift, it can be argued from a certain point of view that it only became a hindrance to the Watch over time and contributed to their decline somewhat. It may have been beneficial at the time, but it's clear there was a lot of unintended consequences that were not foreseen by Alysanne when she pushed for the new gift. Now, I don't personally agree with this fan theory 100%, because to get to this conclusion you have to make a hell of a lot of assumptions. But the reason I did want to talk about it is because it's the perfect example of how a political leader can make these sweeping decisions about things they are way too uninformed about, that may be well-meaning, but can have far-reaching and long-lasting consequences that could have been avoided if they had listened to their advisors. In this case, if Lord Stark's warnings had been heeded. Like I said, I don't hold this one against Alysanne personally that much, but does go to show the impact long-term of playing politics with an already complex situation, as well-meaning as you are. A ruler needs a good head and a true heart. A cock is not essential. If your grace truly believes that women lack the wit to rule, plainly you have no further need of me. Alysanne to Jaehaerys, shortly before the second quarrel. Fire and Blood, heirs of the dragon. A question of succession. Alysanne is seen as this huge advocate for the rights of women in Westeros, and well, she was. She did a lot of good work with things such as the widow's law and the outlawing of the right to the first night, and she did push for the succession rights of her own daughter Daenerys as the eldest child before she sadly died. Then again for the rights of Princess Rhaenys Targaryen after her father Aemon died in 92 AC. But something that is fair to point out is while she did indeed defend the rights of women to inherit, it had not always been that way. When Maegor the Cruel died and Jaehaerys took the throne, Jaehaerys and Alysanne's elder sister Rhaena also had a strong claim, being their father's eldest child. And while it seemed that at first Rhaena had no interest in claiming the throne, given the hell of a lot of trauma she had been through over the last few years, at some point later she does seem to have come to resent the fact that her younger brother and sister had taken it. She once would tell Alysanne, "You have my throne, content yourself with that." You also have the Aerea Targaryen side of the debate as well, where even if you didn't believe Rhaena to be the rightful queen, surely you cannot dismiss Aerea's claim, being the eldest child of Aegon the Uncrowned and Rhaena herself. So simply, we have Aegon the Uncrowned, the disputed king, and eldest child of King Aenys, with Aerea Targaryen being his eldest child and heir. Years later, we have Alysanne's own son, Prince Aemon, dying, leaving behind his only daughter, Rhaenys, as his heir. The argument here, if Alysanne so steadfastly backed Rhaenys' claim to the throne in 92 AC, why did she not also back her niece's claim to the throne in 48 AC? For her to back Rhaenys and not Rhaena or Aerea, as some fans like to point out, could be seen as kind of hypocritical. And well, it kind of is. But there are a few key factors that I think go a long way in explaining this. Firstly, we must recall that when Jaehaerys came to the throne in 48 AC, Alysanne was a child of 12, and at the time was not even married to Jaehaerys, and thus not queen herself. Even when she became queen, she was 13, 14. I don't think you can really blame Alysanne at such a young age for not supporting the claims of her sister or niece. Frankly, it's a politically complex matter, and a lot for effectively a child to comprehend. By the time She was old enough to perhaps understand the situation and form her own thoughts. It was far too late to really do anything about it. Jaehaerys was well established as king, and was doing a good job at it. And she was queen, and was using her position of power to help with the plight of women and small folk in Westeros in other ways. By the time the succession crisis of 92 AC comes about, Alysanne was 56 years old, and not a child anymore. She had lived her whole life. So it's perfectly acceptable for her to now have established her own views on the matter of succession by this time. I think that given the fate of Rhaena and Aerea, thanks to the way the cards played out, it may have even influenced her on the succession somewhat. So while Alysanne's actions are technically hypocritical, there are some genuinely valid reasons as to why. All these things we've discussed in this video. Negative things, yes. But do these negative things mean that Alysanne does not deserve the title of the Good Queen? No, because on balance, like Jaehaerys, she did a hell of a lot more good, with these bad things a small fraction of her legacy. I think the hypocritical nature of her view of inheritance, as well as the new gift, or interesting ideas, can be a bit reaching in terms of their real impact. However, you cannot argue that Alysanne's parenting had an impact on the fates of, at the very least, Viserra and Gael. You might even be able to make the case as well for Daela and Saera to some degree. But this is exactly why I enjoy how George R.R. Martin has constructed his world history in Fire and Blood, and what makes House Targaryen feel more like a real royal family. Historically, even if we look at the best kings of Europe, they all made some bad calls, and had some family scandal, which is exactly what's reflected with Jaehaerys and Alysanne. Good rulers on balance, that still had their own shortfalls and family drama.